The sermon title for today is Thank God for Perfect Children. Thank God. So how many have got perfect children? How many? Yeah, that's... you're doing that because they're watching you? Yeah, you're doing that. Well, Nate's actually trying to stick his mum's hand up. I don't think that works that way. How many have got children? Well, here's a bit. Better still, how many people here were perfect children? Oh, yeah. It's amazing, isn't it, that there's so many more people that believe they were perfect children compared to those parents who actually believed they had perfect children. It's amazing, isn't it? How many people can remember getting in trouble for something they didn't actually do? Oh, yeah. I think all the time still, Pastor Ray. Is that right? Yeah, all the time. That's right. Now, I think we all have those stories, don't we? My children certainly are able to tell me in chapter and verse how many times they've got in trouble for something they didn't do. And that happens sometimes, doesn't it? But, I mean, my mum tells the story. The only time she was ever smacked by her dad was when she actually didn't do anything wrong. He thought she had been disobedient, and he hadn't, and he smacked her. Only time ever he smacked her, and she wasn't actually wrong. She still remembers that. Why? Probably because she hadn't done anything wrong. I was probably the opposite of that. So I was sort of on the other end of the scale, of the naughty scale, if you know what I mean. If my mum was up one end of the scale, I was down the other side. And there's probably rare times that I got smacked for something I didn't do. That was probably, and even if I did, it was probably fair because I've probably done another half a dozen things that I hadn't been caught for. In fact, I had my first cigarette, smoked my first cigarette when I was 8. I know, it sounds incredible, isn't it? I mean, my daughter's 9, my youngest daughter's 9. When I was 8, I smoked my first cigarette. And of course, no one's going to give a cigarette to an 8-year-old, are they? And so I had to go and shoplift them. I had to steal them in order to get an 8 years old, right? So I understand a little bit about not being a perfect child. It's hard to imagine, isn't it, that I was that I wasn't a perfect child. But I know a little bit about what it's like to be not a perfect child. And my parents, of course, know a little bit about what it's like to parent a child that isn't perfect. Well, have a think for a minute what it would have been like to have a perfect child. Imagine if you'd had a perfect child or you have a perfect child. Imagine what that would look like. For some of us, that child would be sort of respectful at home. Maybe that's what that child would look like if they were a perfect child. Or maybe they would do the chores without asking or without being asked, or maybe at all. Or maybe they'd try hard at school. Maybe that's what a perfect child would look like for you. Or maybe they would, when they weren't, they'd spend every waking moment when they weren't doing that, maybe they'd be at sport. Maybe that might be our idea of the perfect child. Or maybe they'd have lots of nice friends. Maybe we'd think that would be a perfect child. Or maybe they might even have a job. Okay, that's probably taken a little bit too far on the perfect child. But the Bible gives us a glimpse into the world of a couple that had a perfect child. It does. I mean, the Bible tells us in Hebrews 4, it says that Jesus was without sin. He was tempted in every way, but he was without sin. So it goes to it's logical, isn't it, that therefore he didn't sin as a child either. He was without sin as a child. He was the perfect child. So we're all sitting there going, okay, Mary and Joseph had a pretty easy life, didn't they? They had the perfect child. Life was pretty good if you're Mary and Joseph. They had a dream run. Well, let's see how this dream run goes for them. And we're going to have a look in the Bible in Luke chapter 2. And if you've got a Bible, you're welcome to look it up. We're going to put it on the screen. Luke chapter 2, starting in verse 41. And this is what the dream run looks like. Every year, Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. When he was 12 years old, they went up to the festival according to the custom. After the festival was over, while his parents were returning home, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but they were unaware of it. Thinking he was in their company, they travelled on for a day. Then they began looking for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they went back to Jerusalem to look for him. All right, this is the dream run, parents. This is what the dream run looks like. So to give you some context, the Passover festival, which is celebrated every year, of course it was to celebrate their escape from Egypt. And the Jews of today, of course, it's still celebrated by Jewish people today, the Passover. It's one of the most enduring ceremonies. And so according to law at the time, every male was required to go up to Jerusalem for some of the Passover. There was a 2-day period that they had to attend the bits that they would do. But the festival itself would go for about a week. But there was 2 days that they would specifically have to go for if you were a male. And there was sacrifices and that sort of stuff. But in that whole week, there'd be more stuff. You know, it was a bit like the Ekka. You know, there's only one day of the Ekka, but it goes for a whole week, you know, so there's more stuff on. Now, the women weren't required to go under law. They weren't required. Often they would. And, of course, if you were celebrating the Passover and you lived in Jerusalem, of course, the family would celebrate it together. But there was no requirement if you lived in, say, Nazareth, like Jesus' parents did, to travel if you're a woman, nor were the children required. Okay, but we see here a bit of an insight into Jesus' parents, because it tells us that not only did Joseph go every year as a pious Jew, but Mary would go too, and their children, or in this case at least Jesus. Now, we know from Mark 6 that Jesus had at least 6 other brothers and sisters. We know he had 4 brothers and at least 2 sisters. We don't know much more than that. But chances, he was the oldest, of course, so chances are, when they were old enough to make the travel, and it was about 80 miles, so we're talking about 130 kilometres or so, which would be done on foot, or maybe riding on, you know, donkeys and camels, but they weren't wealthy people, so they probably would do most of it on foot. And they would travel in there. Now, they would take some of their children clearly with them because Jesus has gone in there. And so they would walk about 4 days. It would take them about 4 days. It's not that distance in the crow flies, but Samaria was between Nazareth and Jerusalem, and they wouldn't go through Samaria because the Samaritans didn't like the Jews, so they'd sort of skirt around and they'd miss Samaria. And generally they'd go in a big caravan. That was the deal because of robbers and things. And so they would go, and we read here that unlike most people, they would go for the whole festival. So they wouldn't just go for the very minimum, right? They wouldn't turn up just for the actual sacrifice and for the Passover meal. They would go for the whole festival, it tells us. And they would go with the whole family. Clearly they were a very devout family. But what happens, of course, is Jesus goes missing, doesn't he? And they're very worried. You can imagine how they would have felt when they realised he wasn't there. Now, if you've ever left your children anywhere, you will know a little bit about what they feel. Now, how many people, you don't have to put your hands up for this one, how many people have actually left their child somewhere when they've, you know, accidentally left them somewhere? A fair few. If I was to ask you to put your hand up, there'd be a fair few. In fact, we keep leaving one of our particular children here at church. And Janet thinks that she's taken home with her, and I sort of think that he's gone home with Janet. And anyway, sometimes she's left here. And, you know, that's unfortunate in many ways. But the bottom line is she's at church, right? And she's 5 minutes away from where we live. It's not a big deal, okay? And it's her anyway. So, but if you can imagine, they've left their child, they've walked for a day, and they're a day away. They can't jump on a bus and get there any quicker. It's a day's walk back, and then they've got to find him. So you can imagine the anxiety that they would have been feeling as a result of this. You know, once I was in a car park at Brookside at the shopping centre, and a lady drove off with a car capsule sitting on top of her car, the baby capsule, you know, the baby car capsule. And a man saw this, and he was running at the car, yelling at her. And I think she must have thought that he was like trying to steal a car or something or other. So she sped off. And thankfully, for whatever reason, the baby wasn't in the capsule. She used to just carry it in the capsule and transfer the baby into a car seat inside the car. Why you do that, I don't know, but that's what she did. And so the capsule was empty. But everyone, when they saw this, was like, and you imagine how she felt, you know, thinking, oh my goodness, what if the baby had been on top of that car? You know, she was obviously very distressed at the whole thing as well. I think all of us would sort of understand the experience. But though, the good news, I think, is that sometimes parents forget things, like their children, but very few of us would have forgotten them for a whole day and then found that we were a day's journey away from them. So in Mary and Joseph's defence here, they would travel in these large caravans, and often they're coming from Nazareth, and their family and friends would be part of this caravan. They'd travel out, they'd travel back. It protected them from robbers and a whole bunch of different things. And so probably 12-year-old Jesus, they're just assuming he's off with the cousins and, you know, playing with his mates or whatever. That would be pretty normal in the caravan. And it's not until evening when they're expecting him to turn up to eat something, which is what most 12-year-old boys eventually want to do. And, of course, he doesn't show up, and that's when they're concerned. So we can probably be not too critical of Mary and Joseph for this. So they're probably expecting him. But he isn't. He stayed behind, and it looks like he didn't even tell his parents, doesn't it? That's what it looks like. I mean, maybe he did, and it doesn't mention it, but it looks like he stayed behind in Jerusalem, and he hasn't told his parents. Now, there's lots of parents here would argue that Jesus has done the wrong thing here. That's what they would argue. I mean, he's a child, he's 12, And under the Jewish culture, you weren't considered a man before God until about 14. It was sort of around puberty, but it was around 14. In fact, they celebrate that, not at this time. They didn't do bar mitzvahs back in this time, but the Jewish people today do a bar mitzvah, which celebrates their coming into manhood, and they're considered an adult before God at that point. But clearly he wasn't, and Luke is making the point that he was still considered a child. He's still under the authority of his parents, but clearly it's expected that he would be somewhat responsible here. And as parents, we would probably say he's at fault for not having told his parents. And because of what he's done, his parents have got the fright of their lives. They've walked 20 miles in one direction, and they've had to turn around and walk the other 20 miles back again to go and search for him. Now, you might be a better parent than me, but at that point, if I'm Joseph, I'm probably thinking I've been a little bit inconvenienced at that point. That's probably what I'm thinking. I'm feeling a little bit. I think we can all categorically state here that Jesus inconvenienced his parents. I think we could probably make that assumption. You can make your own assumptions, but that's the assumption I'm going to make. And so really, the bad news for us parents is that it's clearly not a sin to inconvenience your parents. Because he was without sin, right? Well, I tell you what, I'm a father of 5, so I'm not going to develop this point any further. That one's going straight through to the keeper, and we're going to move right along. But that's, I suppose, that's not the point of this message. But that's one of the conclusions you've got to make, isn't it? That inconveniencing your parents is not a sin. And I'm not going to say that ever again. Now we're going to move along and see what happens after they come back. And this is from verse 46 onwards. It says this: After 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. His mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." "Why were you searching for me?" he asked. "Didn't you know I had to be in my father's house?" But they did not understand what he was saying to them. Now, the Bible translators here have used the term anxiously searching here. It's a good translation, actually. That's a perfect translation of that. The literal term, of course, is painfully seeking. We wouldn't say painfully seeking. I was painfully seeking someone. That wouldn't make any sense. So anxiously searching is good. But essentially what they're describing here is emotional agony. They are in emotional agony, and they're in it for 3 days. So 3 days of emotional agony while they're searching for Jesus to find out where he is. I mean, how many parents can relate to their children giving them emotional agony? I think there's a certain point where all of us can understand that emotional agony is part and parcel of being a parent. I mean, so here's some more bad news. Clearly, it's not a sin to cause your parents emotional agony. Because he did. That's what he's done here. He has caused, by his actions, by staying behind in the temple, he's caused them emotional agony. Now, of course, the reason for the emotional agony might be sinful. Of course, that might be what's causing the emotional agony, the fact that they're not walking the way, we would have hoped that they were. So that's not the case. The point isn't that, that the children can go around doing all this. That's not my point at all. But what I'm saying is that just making someone anxious clearly isn't a sin. Otherwise, we've just disproved Hebrews 4, haven't we? That's certainly not the case, not the point here. Now, I could spend some more time talking about the way Jesus responds here. Because if you have a look at it, he doesn't apologise to them, does he? He doesn't say, "Oh, sorry, Mum, my bad." He doesn't do any of that. In fact, you could probably put a case that he basically implies it's their fault for not having worked out that, of course, he's in the temple. Where else is he going to be? You could probably put a case forward that says he implies that here to them. But the real lesson of this, for today at least, is that even a perfect child can be difficult to parent. And it brings with it anxiety and concern. Even the perfect child brings this sort of anxiety and concern. And of course, even perfect people aren't problem-free. Now, you can imagine having Jesus as your brother. You think it's bad for the parents. Imagine being James, the brother of Jesus, right? You're the second oldest, probably, at this point. Imagine, something gets done in the house. Joseph calls all the children together and says, "Who did that? Jesus, did you do that?" And Jesus goes, "Wasn't me, Father." And he says, James, it must have been you. And James goes, oh, of course, you're going to believe Jesus. He's perfect. You know, you can imagine the frustration of having the perfect brother. It would have absolutely driven him nuts. But the point, of course, is that even a perfect person like Jesus, even a perfect child, can be difficult to parent. Because parenting is actually pretty tough work. Being a father or a mother is actually pretty hard work. But even so, even when we know it's difficult to parent, we forgive a lot of what our children do, isn't it? We forgive and we forget a lot of what the anxiety that we have and the problems that our children cause to us. No doubt, Mary and Joseph felt more relief than frustration when they found Jesus. Okay, I imagine that would be what they case. And sometimes that can be pretty extreme, the way we sort of ignore the imperfections of our children. I mean, there was a case recently in the US, I don't know if you saw it, where an Australian baseball player was shot and killed by a bunch of young men. I don't know if you saw that. And one of the young men there, he was caught red-handed. He confessed what he'd done to the police, and yet the mother, when she was on the TV, still said, it couldn't have been my son, he doesn't do that. And then she proceeded to make an alibi for him on television, on live television. Oh, he was with me. Oh, if he wasn't with me, he couldn't have possibly been there because I saw, she was graving straws. The imperfect child, and she was trying to make him perfect. She was trying to make it all go away. In her mind, it couldn't possibly be her son that had done all those things. But clearly, he was caught red-handed, and he confessed to it. Parents sometimes have a very biased view of their children. But even the most biased parent probably isn't going to say that our children are perfect. In fact, I doubt Mary and Joseph, when they got home, were going around saying, oh, have you checked out our perfect child Jesus? We ended up missing him for 3 days and had to find him. And it's like, good thing he's perfect, huh? I don't think that they were doing that. I don't think that they were walking around saying that as well. So for many of us, our children cause us emotional agony, and yet we love and care for them anyway, don't we? Because that's what parents do. That's what fathers do. Well, in the same way that we accept that none of us have perfect children, there's a whole bunch of people here that don't have children, but all of us have had a father. I wonder how many of us accept the fact that we don't have a perfect father. I think our standards that we hold our fathers to are probably a lot greater than the standards that we hold our children to. None of us would say that we had a perfect father, I dare say. Maybe there might be some people here who would say they had, but none of us, I would suspect, would say that. But on the other hand, none of us would be here, would we, if it wasn't for the father? If nothing else, there's a biological process that father has had to be part of in order to be able to give us life. Every one of us owes our existence at some point to our father, don't we? Now, of course, a lot of us owe a lot more than that. A lot of us have had rich relationships with their fathers, and of course, some people have not had a very rich relationship. Some people may not have even met their father before, their earthly father. And surely just because someone becomes a biological father, if you become a father before, that's actually the easy bit. That's the simple part, is becoming the father, right? But being a good father, that's the hard bit. But it's Father's Day, right? So why is it that just the biological act of becoming a father, why does that mean we get any special sort of recognition? That doesn't matter. Certainly in an Australian experience, that sort of bites at the core a bit, doesn't it? Like, why are we recognising someone just because they went through the biological act of becoming a father? Why are we honouring that? Why are we recognising that? Well, especially since none of them are perfect. They're all imperfect, aren't they? And we've got imperfect fathers, so why are we honouring and recognising them this day? Well, this day around to dedicated to honouring fathers hasn't been around all that long. In fact, in Australia, it's only been sort of officially recognised since 1956. So there'll be people here probably who can remember a time before there was an official Father's Day. So 1956 was when Australia recognised it. And the first Father's Day church service that people know about was actually held in the US about 50 years before that. And I've got a little clip here that's going to explain to us what that was all about. You may have noticed that the first Father's Day service came about because of an absence of fathers. It wasn't, hey, let's go and get our dad's presents. It was actually an absence. It was what was missing, not what was present, that actually made the families realise how important the fathers were. Now, these were a bunch of imperfect men, no doubt. They were unlikely to be perfect fathers. Those 300 men that died in that cave-in in the mine are unlikely to have been the best fathers in the world. In fact, they were probably now most notable by the fact that they were missing, not just because of the way they were fathers. Well, we learn from the story of the perfect child that it's hard to parent even perfect children. It takes patience, and it takes forgiveness, and it takes love, none of which come naturally to imperfect fathers. None of which. They would have not have come naturally to those 300 men that lost their lives. In fact, Jesus' earthly father wasn't present during his ministry either. He wasn't there when he died, when Jesus was died at age about 33. We don't actually know what happened to Joseph. That's where we just read about Joseph. That was the last time the Bible really gives us much information about him. Jesus gets referred to as the son of Joseph, but really we don't have any more information other than that what we just read about Jesus' earthly father. And if you read about what Jesus spoke about, he never even mentions his earthly father. He mentions God. He either refers to or addresses God over 250 times as Father. But he never mentions his earthly father. It's interesting, isn't it? Now, does that mean that Joseph was a bad father? Clearly he was an imperfect father. He's an imperfect man. But does that mean he was a bad father? No, everything we read about Joseph in those early years points to a good, pious man who was a good father. We know that Jesus was a carpenter because he grew up under the tutelage of his dad. That's the way it worked. That's how he became a carpenter, because his dad was a carpenter. We know that his father protected them, even to the point of taking them to Egypt, took them away to protect them. We know that he sacrificed a whole bunch of things, his livelihood and his location and his family connections and things for the sake of Jesus. This was not a bad father we're talking about, but we don't hear from him. Now, church history says that he actually died just before Jesus' ministry. That's what the early church believed. Whether or not that's true or not, the Bible doesn't say. But clearly we've got to say that he was not vital to Jesus' ministry. Otherwise, he would have been there, wouldn't he? Or at least Jesus would have been making mention of him. He doesn't even say, let me tell you the story about my dad. He doesn't even tell one of those. He doesn't tell a parable involving his own father. You see, Jesus didn't actually need Joseph to be the perfect father because he already had one. He didn't need a perfect earthly dad because he had the perfect heavenly father. Now, of course, I bet Jesus missed him. I bet you just like the children of those dads who were killed in the mine cave-in, I bet you Jesus missed his dad. I've got no doubt that he would have. But Joseph was still imperfect, but I suspect that the imperfect father, Joseph, would have been good enough anyway, even though he wasn't perfect. Dads were a little bit like these stones. I've got a little pile of stones over there, this stone here. Dads are a bit like stones in some ways. None of these stones are really the same. The chance of this stone being exactly the same as all those is pretty remote, as you can imagine. And some of them are not quite as wide as they probably should be. This one's got a bit of an edge on it, a bit of a sharp edge on it. There's a crack that runs just straight through the middle there. Bit of a weakness there in it. There's a bit of a blemish on that side, bit of a pit. Now this side's pretty sort of pitted and blemished. Some of the stones are large, some of them are small. Dads are a little bit like stones. Earthly fathers we're talking about here. Of course, we'd all like to have the perfect stone as our father, wouldn't we? We'd all like to have the beautiful, perfectly round, flawless stone as a representative of our father, wouldn't we? Earthly father, that'd be great. Maybe he caused us some pain. Maybe he caused us a lot of pain. Maybe our father actually caused us more pain than anyone on the planet. What we'd really love would be to have a perfectly round stone, wouldn't we, as our father, as representative of our earthly father. But of course, none of us do, because we don't need to. We don't need the perfectly round rock. We don't need the perfect father, because the perfect rock, the Bible tells us, is Jesus, the living stone. And the perfect father is God. That's who we need. Now, if I was to take this stone and put it over there, that's got water in it, that dish. If I was to drop this in the water, it wouldn't stop the water from becoming water, would it? If I drop this in the water, the water's the same water. Just because it's got a rock in it doesn't change the fact that it's water. But it has changed something. The level of the water went up just a tiny bit, didn't it? That rock didn't change the water, but it added to the overall volume in the bowl. That's what the rock did. The stone helps the water fill more of the bowl. That's what it does. Well, our earthly fathers are the same. They add to our lives, but they don't decide who we are. Only, of course, our Heavenly Father does that. Our Heavenly Father who doesn't get it wrong, who doesn't fail to love us when we need to be loved, who understands us actually better than we do, who doesn't fail to understand us when we need it to. An earthly Father that's always there, who didn't, disappear out of our lives early maybe. But what a great role for an earthly father to be able to add a little bit of volume to the bowl. What a great role that we have as dads, for those of us whose your dads are still around, and for those that are dads with children. What a great role that we have to add a little bit of volume to the child's life. We can't change the water with a rock, but we can make it a little bit bigger than it was just on its own. And it's interesting, isn't it, that the first Father's Day came about because everyone in that particular mining town, especially the ones that lost the families, they saw what happened when we pulled the rock out. When the rock came out of the water, the level went down, didn't it? It went down just a little bit. The bowl was a little bit more diminished because the rock wasn't there. The water hasn't changed, but the volume has. Just as those families at the first Father's Day service, they clearly learned, following the deaths of their dads, that there's a little bit of a difference that a dad can make.